you beautiful raid bastards. What's going on, man? It's Preacher, and I want to have some raid talk, because we don't have enough opportunity to do that these days, so let's fucking do it. Let's talk about, let me ask you this question. This is the question we're going to pose and hopefully get a discussion going. Is Brambles a good mechanic? Oh, such a simple question. Is Brambles a good mechanic? You're asking loads of questions in there, aren't you? You're asking loads of questions. So no doubt if you are doing some raiding, you've come across this, and if you've done some Mythic, you know all about the fact that it's about to just stick its thorny fucking dick up your ass and just take you to school and manage it in all kinds of different ways. But also, you'll be aware, of course, addons can't track it. Not the first time we've seen something like this. Good Lady Sinestra, covered in scars, rip, was also a mechanic that wasn't tracked by addons. However, it did come with a rather large visual cue. Very easy to detect even in the stress that was going on in that fight. So Blizzard have toyed around with this before, and they have said, going forward into Legion, is that they want to take away information away from the player. They want to do that, and we're going to talk about that as well today. So this is our first real example of something that's working along those lines, is the Brambles at Cenarius. So there's two questions there. One is, are mechanics that don't involve add-on detection a good idea? Right? Is this something we want to see more of or less of? And I'm sure we'll have conflicting views on that. And also, is Brambles in itself a good mechanic for Cenarius? So let's answer the easy one first, which is Brambles a good mechanic on Cenarius? Well, let's consider if we took Brambles away for now, right? Let's take away that mechanic. What have we got to deal with? Certainly at the Mythic level, yeah? We've got to deal with Twisted Sisters. That involves everybody spreading around and, you know, being all away from each other. We've got the Nightmare Ancients, where we have to gather. We have to keep a certain radius away from the boss itself because of Dreadthorns. Everybody's probably been there when they nuked an ad and Dreadthorns was too close and you were like, I'm rip, what happened? We also have Wisps, which needs to be CC'd, stunned, kited away, don't let them move around too much, all these kind of things going on there. And we have the Rotted Drake with his breath, which involves us moving away from the breath and moving around. And there's a current theme across all of these things, and that is movement of the raid, constant shifting of positions all the time. And Cenarius actually gives us a rather large platform. Not quite Lei Shen sized, I mean, it's comparable, I suppose, but it's a huge space. Now, if we took Brambles away, this fight instantly becomes like normal mode, right? Even at the Mythic level, it becomes normal mode because it's so fucking easy if you can freely move the raid around. So fucking easy if you can move around. Brambles are the defining, despite all the shit that the ads do, the defining mechanic, the absolute must-have mechanic is Brambles. It must exist in some form. There has to be something that reduces your movement space in order for that fight to pose any form of challenge. Otherwise, it's simply collapse, spread out, DPS. That's it. That's the whole fight in a nutshell. So yes, Brambles is needed. Now, we could go in depth with that a little bit. If we don't take Brambles away, what if Brambles had a fixate that we could track in some way automatically? I would say that's just as bad as taking Brambles away, honestly. In the alpha and the beta, or the beta I should say, during raid testing, they did actually put a big pair of red eyes above you. Addons still couldn't track it, but you did get a big pair of red eyes above you that said, the fixate is on you. And they took it away. Why? If we knew exactly to the second when Brambles spawn, and they kind of derp around a little bit, don't they? And then they like pick somebody. If we knew to the point exactly when someone was fixated, we would have a Brambles spot where you go with the Brambles. You go over there and you get it out of the way. That's just as simple almost as taking Brambles away. It involves a little bit more complication because they still have to be cleared, blah, 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 blah. But we would have a Brambles spot. You go here with Brambles. That's it. That's all we would do as raiders. We would like, this is where you go with Brambles. Keep it away from everywhere else. Blah, 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 blah. Run to purple or run to blue or whatever the hell you would be doing your raid. That's just as simplified for most Mythic raiders as it not existing in the first place, right? So, yeah, that's why they've taken it away. So, the idea that this mechanic exists and cannot be tracked by addons is pretty much the only way this mechanic, which is the defining mechanic of the fight, could exist in a way to pose a real threat and to actually be something we have to manage, okay? So I do agree with how Brambles is implemented as being a good mechanic. I think it makes the fight, not to say that like it has to always be this way, but the way that fight is designed, it had to have something that reduced your play space, And they could have done that in a number of ways. They could have had things popping out the ground, but we've seen that a couple of times. We saw it on Archimond. All these kind of things. These sort of stand mechanics that we've seen before. Or they had to have something which was player controlled and gave some skill to it, which then pushed it up to the mythic level. And Brambles are a skill mechanic. So it really highlights these sort of three categories of raiders that I've discussed for many years. You'll have the guy who just doesn't notice, right? Blah, blah, blah. Common problem that you'll have is certainly when you're doing like mythic level is, you know, somebody who just doesn't say, I've got Brambles, or doesn't say they got hit, so they change targets. And they just end up everywhere, right? They just fill up the area. You'll know those guys when they get it. Or you'll have the kind of middle category. They do recognize that Brambles is chasing them. Maybe they recognize it a little bit late, and they just beeline, like, to fucking Orgrimmar. Like, they suddenly needed some flasks, and they leave, like, one giant line across the room, and it's like, dude, really? And then you'll get your sort of top-tier raider who's like, oh, I have Brambles. Am I scared of Brambles? No. Alright, so what am I going to do? I'm going to, like, position these in a really super awesome way. I'm going to overlap them. I'm going to make the surface area that they cover in the room just be, like, super small, and therefore make them a non-issue for everybody else, right? That'd be a standout sort of mechanic that we'd look at in a standout video. So, yeah, I think this adds a really good skill element on an individual basis to the fight. So, overall, yeah, Brambles, good mechanic, happy with it. I think it's pretty solid. A lot of people hate it. I think it's actually so defining to the fight that without it, or if it was modified pretty much in any way, it would really just render that fight to be such a pushover and just be a waste of time. Now, let's talk about the fact that it's not trapped by add-ons. And I'm sort of moving away from Brambles here a little bit and talking about mechanics in general that cannot be tracked by add-ons, right? Because this is the second part of the question. I'm okay with it. I'm okay with it as long as it's done in a proper way. One concern that I have with Brambles is that it essentially, for most classes, CCs them for quite a long time. And if you get back to back with it, you can spend a sort of inordinate amount of time just running around and not doing anything. And now, technically, and we have to say this, technically Cenarius is not a DPS race. Technically. However, most of us know by now that it's pretty much a Zerg, right? It's pretty much a Zerg, because you soon figure out Cenarius doesn't have that much HP, and he has these breakpoints where he'll spawn more adds, and every single time you can cut one of those phases out, the fight becomes significantly easier. So it kind of is, but it's not designed to be. So we encounter that every now and again, don't we, where this fight isn't designed to work this way, but if we do this, then we can kind of change how the fight is supposed to be done. So Brambles is, in the very specific example of Brambles, is you have to, one, look at it, obviously position your camera in such a way so you can see it. You've got to check it. Then you've got to see, is it coming to me? Then you might have someone near you. Then you've got to check if it's going to, is it going to you or is it going to them? And then you figure it out, and then you start sort of kiting it around or whatever. You can get fixated back to back, and you can spend, what, about 12, 15 seconds sometimes just running around with Brambles, and yeah, it gets a little tiresome. Not too bad if you're on farm, but during progress it can get a little tiresome. I do think it CCs you for a little too long sometimes, but that would be that's a minor concern. Let's look at it from Blizzard's point of view. They have to design boss mechanics, getting back to the second part of the question. They have to design boss mechanics around the idea that people have add-ons for them, right? And they know exactly when that big explosion is coming. They know exactly when the boss is about to do that big hit. They know exactly when it's going to phase change. And therefore, they're really restricted in many ways as to how creative they can be with mechanics in general. I'm not talking about Brambles here, I'm just talking about any kind of mechanic. Let me give some clarity on that. So let's look at Blackhand Heroic. Was it Mythic or Heroic then? Whatever, the hardest version. And the Explosive Siege Engine, which everybody knows when that's going to happen because it's when you kill the Explosive Siege Engine. But because we know exactly when things like that are going to happen, they have to make that damage so deadly because, of course, we can counter it. Now, when they design raid-wide damage, unless it's something that can kill you, like at Mythic level, it's a non-factor. Unless it's constant, it's a non-factor. Why? Because the raid knows, because of add-ons and timers, exactly when this is going to happen. So they have to design it in a way that's going to make people use cooldowns, but it can always be done predictably. And it's the predictability of how to counter things that really limits and stagnates your creativity, I think, in determining mechanics. You really have to be careful with this stuff, because add-ons are always going to tell people exactly how to counter it and when to counter it, and to line up and timers. So we have healing cooldown orders, don't we? We have specific times we're going to be using DPS cooldowns. All this is factored in a way that we know exactly when it's going to happen. It happens at 3 minutes in the fight. When do we get into the Iron Il'gynoth? It happens at like 2 minutes. It happens at 3 minutes. We can plan around it. Now, that's a cool thing, but it also restricts boss mechanic design, because you have to design around the fact that everybody knows exactly when this is going to happen. And you can't really have unpredictable things happen for a lot of things, because that screws up the timers. Every single time you design a boss mechanic, you have to have in your mind that everybody knows exactly when this is going to happen. So how do we make this a threat? That's the big question. How do we make this mechanic a threat if we know that everybody in the raid is fully aware of when this is about to happen? Because you can't design, say, a tank attack that's completely and utterly random that can kill the tank. Can you? You can't do that. So you have to be really careful about how you design mechanics. So from that perspective, for me, I'm really happy with them adding in mechanics that go against boss add-ons. Boss add-ons can't track it, and using far more visual cues. It's something really, if you think about it, it's something you've been doing for a very long time. If we go back to Blackrock Foundry, we look at the stampers on Hans and Franz. I'm not talking about difficult fights here, but you look at the stampers for your visual cue. Yeah, so that's about player awareness as well. That's bringing the same sort of thing in. And then we look at Archimond, you look at the pattern on the floor when it shoots out the floor. Those kind of mechanics don't need timers. It's okay that we know when it's going to happen, but it still comes down to the player as long as it's a bit more unpredictable. Hans and Franz was fully predictable in how to counter it, and it kind of had to be because of the way the room was structured. But if Blizzard is able to implement more mechanics, for me, I think raiding would be taken to the next level right now. I think it's a good door that we could open to say this is going to really push raiding into the next level. Because what we've seen over the last couple of years is rehashing of old mechanics and just slapping more on. So we've seen a lot of that in Emerald Nightmare. We've seen that with Xavius, where Xavius is basically a rehash of an old boss, but they've strapped more mechanics onto it because players have had experience. Boss add-ons have become so concise. I mean, we get them on the day now, pretty much. These guys are releasing these add-ons on the day of the release content to get this information out to you. And it also makes things very, very sort of, how do we counter this? You just go through a checklist, don't you? Yeah, if you're a raid leader or whatever, if you're interested in doing mechanics properly, you go through a checklist of what's going to happen in the fight, how do we counter it, and you come up with this list. Instead of things happening and you're like, oh, what do we do if this happens? What do we do if that happens? What do we do if this happens? And that's always been the funnest type of raiding for me. So if we look at something like Omnitron Defense System, not knowing what order they were going to come out as was always an interesting part of the fight, because you had to counter that in different ways. You had a semi-plan of how things was going, but if you got a different order, it would shift and move around and cause adaptation. Something I really found enjoyable on the Dragons of Nightmare is we know what's going to happen, but it's so unpredictable in exactly where. So a flower might spawn in melee, it might spawn really far away because someone's in a bad position, it might spawn as someone going into a portal. All these kind of things are interesting to me, and I really think this is the way they could go with it, as long as it doesn't become criminally annoying. So I want to know your thoughts on this. Is like the lack of, when you find a mechanic that a boss add-on isn't tracking, does that really pressure you? Is that something where maybe, but look at it this way, if it's something that really bothers you and really stresses you out, look at it as an opportunity to get a little bit better at the game. Maybe you're focusing too much on still focusing too much on your bars, on your buttons, or maybe you're still distracted by DPS meters and things like that. And maybe this is the nice opening door for you to be like, okay, I need to be more aware of what's going on around me, because I should be now comfortable with my buttons. I should be more comfortable with when my cooldowns are up. I probably got add-ons that notify me, like tell me when, of important things going on. Maybe now it's time to push that skill level up, where previously I haven't really had to. There's only a couple of fights where you really need to be aware of your environment in Emerald Nightmare. Let's do it. Nethendra with the bugs, which is a kind of weak example, I know, but still, you do have to be aware of the bugs on Nethendra. Dragons of Nightmare. Ursoc, you don't have to pay attention to fucking anything. Spider, Mythic, you don't have to pay attention to anything at all that's going on. What's the other boss? The fuck is the other boss in Emerald Nightmare? You go Nethendra, Ursoc, Spider, Dragons. That's 4. There's another one, isn't there? What the fuck is it? Shit. Andy!
Yes, mate.
What's the bosses in Emerald Nightmare? We go Nathendra, Ursoc, Spider, Dragons. What's the other one before you get to Cenarius?
We said
That's Spider. The Eye! The Eye! Do you pay attention to your environment in the Eye? Not really. What are you paying attention to there? Spew corruption? That's about it, right? I mean, there's not a lot of real environmental awareness needed there. I mean, you could say inside the Eye when the miasma stuff comes out, but not really. I mean, it's bright fucking pink. It's so hard to miss, and the whole raid moves there. I'm up for it. I'm up for it being the new challenge is to push people to be far more aware of their environment and making good decisions on that as well. Like we said, those 3 categories of raiders, you become these better players because you can adapt to things because you're visually taking in information rather than just trying to stick to static things. So I'd love to see your thoughts on that, guys. Have a great day. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.